I ran the lighthouse on Blackcap Reef, 32 miles off a toothy stretch of coast that tourists photograph from safe overlooks and storms carve like a butcher. I was the keeper, the repairman, the cook, the janitor, and the emergency contact when boats got dumb. The first thing the old keeper told me on my first night, when the foghorn moaned like a hungover cow and the lens turned like a heartbeat, was a rule he delivered without a smile. Never let the tower go dark after sundown. Most jobs pretended to be emergencies. Mine rehearsed them. Every evening had a ritual. I would check the oil levels on the backup generator, test the battery bank, run a lint brush over the tiny contacts that made the Fresnel lens motor whisper and rotate. I'd sweep wind-blown salt from the steel stairs because salt turned shreds into glass. I'd set the kettle, not because anyone ever visited after the last boat left, but because the smell of tea kept the station from feeling like a museum. The station was a cylinder of iron and glass, sunk into basalt like a nail into a black thumbnail. It groaned. That was normal. The ocean loved groaning. The island was a misnomer. It was a rock you could pace in 9 minutes if you didn't stop to look down through the spiderweb of tide pools that braided the perimeter like cracked mirrors. The weather station was strapped to the lee side with old belts of rebar. The supply shed was a cube that rattled itself to sleep. When storm swells came from the northeast, spray broke over the lantern room, tapping on the glass like someone's fingertips. I kept my own hours out there, which meant I kept the sea's hours. I logged wind, visibility, barometric pressure. I sent reports no one read unless something went wrong. I'm a lighthouse keeper, I'd say when people at the grocery store asked what I did and then pretended they wanted to hear about it. Still a job, they'd say. Thought satellites did that now. Satellites didn't haul frozen milk up spiral stairs when the elevator sulked. Satellites didn't tie a reef, not around their own loneliness. Blackcap had stories. Every harbor did. Mine said the rock had been taller once, and a wedge of it broke off during a storm in the 1880s, taking a work crew's bunkhouse with it. No bodies found, the older men would say, but their boots came washing back in ones and threes. Another story said a whaler hit the reef in 1904 and all hands made shore. They lit a driftwood fire so big the fog swallowed it and spat heat back in their faces for hours. In the morning, they were ash gray and giggling and not right after. I didn't put much stock in those stories. I had better ones. Seals that watched me work like old men with front row seats. A caretaker gull that adopted the lantern room and pecked the glass when I forgot its crackers. Every Sunday, when the weather let him, Captain Harrow brought out mail and fresh fruit on a boat the color of chipped enamel. Harrow loved rules because rules were boats that kept you from swimming. He always asked about pressures, about backup redundancy. He always glanced at the lantern room as if it might blink out like a tired eye while he looked away. "Still got your candle?" he'd say. It was a joke from his father's era, when keepers kept the taper near the weights so they could check a fault in the dark. I kept a modern one, an LED torch built like a dumbbell. The joke stayed. "Still got your candle?" "Still got my candle." Now and then, after he cast off, he'd turn in a lazy circle and flash his own light at me from the rail. It meant we were good, and I'd flash once with the service lamp in return. I had my routines. Routines were levees. Alone, you learn the importance of levees. I won't tell you that I never got afraid. Everyone lies when they say that. Fear was built into the place like rust. The steps had a flex to them near the second landing that made your calf muscles ready themselves for a fall. The wind changed pitch when it slid past the ventilation slits in the service room door. And if you were new, you might think it was a voice. Once, every winter, the generator would give me an unearned silence, and my heart would climb into my throat until the backup relay thunked like a book dropped on a table. I had a rule besides the old one. If my heart climbed, I climbed with it. Up, to the lantern. Check the light. There was a stone your boot found near the northwest railing that rocked in its hole. I wedged it with a splinter of cedar my first year. 10 years later, it still asked for attention when the swell was from the east. It's what the place did. It asked for attention in 100,000 small ways. It was a toddler with the strength of the moon. People think the light matters most to ships. It matters to birds, too. Songbirds on clear nights sometimes crashed into the glass and slid like coins, stunned and trembling, down the metal grates. I learned to cup them and keep them warm until dawn. If they shook themselves like wet dogs and looked at me with their paperclip eyes, I let them go. Sometimes I found bodies tucked in seams and had to glove up. Death dried pretty quick in salt air. I say all this to make a point. The lighthouse was a machine the ocean used to speak to me. It had 1,000 voices, most of them ordinary. On Blackcap, ordinary was my waterline. Trouble was anything that stuck its head above it. The first trouble buried itself in a normal week. The barometer was stubborn. The radio was temperamental. A late summer fog arrived as if lowered by crane, not so thick as to be blinding, but thick enough to redraw distances and make familiar angles feel wrong. I stood in the lantern room with the pane vents cracked and watched the beam write its slow, white alphabet on the nothing. Then the beam shuddered. Not the rotation, the light itself. A tremor like a tired fluorescent in a stairwell. I breathed out and it smudged the glass. I checked the amperage on the panel and the readout was within tolerance. I touched the housing and it was warm, not hot. The lens teeth ticked. The sweep continued, and yet a skip had crept into the glow. It was as if the light got heavier at one particular point in the rotation and had to drag itself across invisible resistance. I watched. I logged it. I took the cover off the junction box and reseated a plug I had reseated 100 times without ever needing to. The light didn't care. It did its slow, perfect work. I told myself it was a trick of fog thickness. As current eddies in a river make the surface look different, maybe fog had a grain to it, and the beam found the grain and caught. Maybe, I wrote in the log. Light appears to stutter at 210 to 240 degrees azimuth. Fog density appears uneven. We'll monitor. It didn't happen the next night. So I put it out of my head with the enthusiasm you save for putting things out of your head in an empty building. I drank tea and watched the clock hands skate their oily circles. My routines again. I checked the weather station mast bolts with a wrench. I walked the perimeter with a headlamp and a radio, pointing the beam into clefts that always looked like mouths. The rock reflected me back in glints like fish scales. I told myself a story I tell when something nudges at the edges of my mind. If something truly required my attention, it would announce itself. Everything else was wind pretending to be important. 3 days later, I found the Gull's crackers arranged on the catwalk in a little pile, each broken piece angled so that the chalky edges were facing the lantern room. I did not do that. Gulls did not do that. I stood there with a box of biscuits and told myself, fine, Wind did that. Wind had been a carpenter around here long before my arrival. Wind worried at anything not nailed, and even some things that were. But I had sealed the crackers up because gulls could smell them from a mile. They had been in the service locker. That lock was stiff from salt and needed a hip to coerce it. I had locked it, and I would have sworn to it as if to a priest. I went down the steps and up again because sometimes you have to move through confusion physically until it breathes. I opened the locker and found the tin's lid on the floor like a disc someone slid out in a hurry. I crouched and searched for droppings or feather down or footprints. There was dust, but it had been smudged by my own work boots earlier. It gave me nothing to hold. I hated that. The human brain wants handles on everything so it can carry them around and file them in cabinets by size. I gave the crackers to the gull because it pecked the glass with righteous fury. I taped a bit of yarn on the locker latch, the way you tape a hair across a drawer if you think a sibling is messing with your stuff. The yarn was a woolly, cheerful blue. It made the steel look friendlier. I said out loud because sometimes you have to make a sound in a place that hoards silence. I saw what you did. The gull tilted its head like a critic. The beam made another stumble 2 nights later, and the stumble lasted. A smear at 225 degrees that no amount of check plug smoothed. I wrote it down because that's what you do when something is bigger than your ability to fix it. You put it in a book. Other entries had names: pressure, wind, visibility. This one I labeled with a shape: lull in brightness, arc like a missing tooth. Both called it in. Heros, a trawler that hugged the 3-mile line with a courtesy that meant they'd been fine before. Light's got a cough, one captain said, half joking. I made my voice the kind of voice that could be plugged into nerves like a painkiller. Working it, I said. Visibility restricted. Beam rotating nominal. I used words that meant you should not worry. I did not say I could not make the light cough on command, and that made it worse. Trouble you can repeat on purpose is trouble you can collaborate with. The radio relay on the mainland was a crackling ear. The tech's voice was far and stern and maddeningly dry. "We'll send someone next week," he said. "You're within hazard tolerance." I laughed after I signed off, which was not the correct emotional response. But your body chooses what to send you and on what schedule. After 10 years, I was good at not arguing with my own weird dispatches. The yarn on the locker was on the floor the next morning, and the locker was unlocked. Inside, the tin was full. Nothing stolen, but there was a damp circle in the dust near the back, like a thumbprint from a wet glove. I slept badly after that, because sleeping badly was the only option besides sleeping not at all. I woke to a foghorn tone that wasn't ours. It was like waking to a hand on your ankle. If you live alone and you wake to a hand, your first thought is not the word hand. Your first thought is all the little words that go under it. Not mine. Not right. No. The extra horn made a noise between our scheduled blasts. A hoarse question shoved into the space where our statements lived. The pattern didn't match any local. I checked the chart and the schedule and the transmitter. Ours was fine. Ours was good, as if proud to be normal. The other one came from the fog itself. Never let the tower go dark after sundown. I still heard the old keeper say it sometimes when I sweated in the lantern room and the lens turned with the patience of planets. He died the summer after he trained me. Hard. On a bus. He had never been on a bus in his life until then. The universe loved its jokes. On the 4th night of the cough, the light didn't just hesitate. It faltered. For 3 seconds, maybe 4, the beam did not exist in the slice of the world where it had existed every rotation since I had met it. If you want to know what darkness is, go somewhere where light is a promise and listen to that promise break. I was halfway up the steps with a toolbox and my LED torch, and I stopped because my body told me if I kept moving, I would do something unprofessional. I would call a name. I would say please. I made myself move again. My palm slid on the rail. My breath came short the way it had the time. I climbed in heavy swell, and the steps hummed with my own idiocy. In the lantern room, the motor was a patient insect. The relay board was an estuary of tiny lights, each one blinking in time to some song I'd learned by heart. The lens was a cathedral, prisms stacked in a ceremony of glass. The lamp burned without blemish. I could see its filament like a spine. When the beam passed the trouble arc, it thinned again to nothing. Looking through the glass, the fog looked no different there than anywhere. But in the beam's absence, the fog felt thicker, as if it had been waiting to flex. I lifted the service lamp, switched it on, and swept. The scatter came back harsh and argumentative like hail. Something in me said, not out loud, not in words, that if I stepped onto the balcony and put my hand out in that dark wedge, something would take. It, not a bite, something more practical, a taken like a coat check. "We'll keep that for you," someone says, and you never get the stub. I do not step out. If you think this is the part where I tell you I heard footsteps, you don't know how this works. Footsteps would have been mercy. What I heard was nothing plus a kind of attention, like being in a room with a dog that watches a door. Nothing changed, and that was the change. I stayed in the lantern room until it grew the pale, thin light the sky gets when it realizes dawn is a job and not a gift. In that light, the beam had no cough. It was perfect. Day does that to night's mistakes. It covers them with a sheet so you can pretend you dreamed them. I made tea, and I took a cup to the catwalk, and I breathed the kelp smell that comes when the tide slacks. The gull landed and stared as if I'd rearranged the furniture. A seal barked. On the horizon, a notch of darker gray suggested the mainland. Everything argued for normal. I radioed the tech again. I kept my words simple and flat as bolts. Light failed for approximately 4 seconds on 3 rotations between 0200 and 0230. Loss occurred between 210 degrees and 240 degrees azimuth. Lamp, motor, and control board normal. Beam bright at all other bearings. Copy, he said, in a voice that belonged to a different building. We'll prioritize. He did not ask me if I was alone. He did not say it the way people say it in movies when they mean something else. He said it the way a man reading from a script would choose not to. So I volunteered it. Just me. There was a pause long enough to grow moss. We'll prioritize, he said again. It would have been funny if I'd had any laughter left. That afternoon the wind turned, bringing a smell that lived downstream of dead fish and upstream of live rot. My coffee tasted like pennies. I walked the perimeter in a tighter loop than usual, the way a dog walks a bed before it lies down. The rock made its little draining noises. Gulls hung in the onshore like laundry. The supply shed's lock had a little chalky bloom of salt around it that looked like cottage cheese. When I breathed on it, the bloom ran, and when I wiped it with my sleeve, the wool came away salted. Inside, the spare lamp sat on its shelf like a monk. I'd changed that lamp twice in 10 years. It felt like a ceremonial act. Put the old one to sleep, bring the new one to light. The idea of doing it at night turned my mouth to paper. There are shapes you see from the corner of your eye when you live where weather is the only traffic. Clouds muscle into each other, and your peripheral vision reads intention. Water laps mirror people bending, and your hindbrain makes them into men. I'd looked at enough things out there to know which were mine and which were not. So when I saw the thing on the seaward side of the catwalk a little below the railing, and my first thought was ladder, I stopped walking because the lighthouse did not have a ladder there. Not anymore. The old iron rungs had been cut away to stop idiots from climbing for photos. The angle of this thing was wrong for rungs anyway. It was a line like a rope under tension. It ran from the hooked lip of basalt up toward the catwalk, met air, and didn't end. My brain wrote the ending. Tied to something, my eyes refused to write the knot. I crouched, which I would not recommend, because crouching makes you pray even when you own the building you're crouching on. I told myself, again, that I was tired and my eyes were rewriting shadows as artifacts. If you stare through fog long enough, you can find a drummer boy carrying a flag and a whale in a waistcoat. The line quivered the way a fishing line does when something on the bottom notices it's wearing jewelry. I stood up too fast and saw little white suns pop behind my eyelids. I swore, and the wind took the word and tossed it back at the rock. I walked on because I needed to be moving towards something that had doors, and because the house part of a lighthouse is honest about what it can do. It has walls. It has a kettle. It cannot argue with a line that isn't tied to anything. I slept again that afternoon. Real sleep, the kind that drags silt over you and sets you on the bottom. I woke to early evening and the taste of cotton in my mouth and the sound of the clock in the kitchen doing its valiant click. I boiled water. I checked my lists. I turned the light on before sundown because habit is armor and I wanted as much armor as I could strap to my skin. The beam found its cough on the second rotation. It did its not there ness again for 3 heartbeats, then 4. I pinched the bridge of my nose and felt the grease of a day's salt there. I told myself a new story because the old one about fog grain wasn't doing the job. I told myself that a cheap relay on the board was half dead. I told myself that a wire had a nick and every rotation rubbed the nick against a burr. I told myself that if I could name the problem, I owned more of it. While the beam passed the dark wedge, the ocean sounded wrong. Not quiet, less layered. Usually there's a stack of sounds, slap, hiss, distant boom, the mutter of stones. The dark wedge made the stack flatter, and what remained came forward in a way that made my pores feel like little mouths. I could hear my own breath against my teeth. I spoke without planning to, because silence was a mouth other things could use. "All right," I said. "All right. We're not doing that." I blew out my cheeks. I put my hand on the warm side of the housing like a man taking a pulse. I thought of the old keeper's rule and heard his voice again. It came with the grained texture of his tobacco. The afternoon I'd met him, he'd tapped the brass in the service room and said, "It'll try to make you make mistakes. The place, the job. They'll try, and you'll help if you let them." And then he'd said it, with the exactness of a commandment. "Never let the tower go dark after sundown." At 0220, the light failed for 8 seconds and came back in a snap that felt like a slap. The relay board didn't hiccup. The motor didn't. The lamp burned like a confession. The beam had absence where it ought to have had presence, and the absence was a shape now. Not a clean arc, a ragged one, as if something with a rough edge were held up to cut it. A torn map. I called the mainland, and someone answered on the second ring who didn't say their name. I gave mine and my coordinates as if I could be somewhere else by accident. "There's no failure on our end," the voice said. It sounded younger than tech voices usually did. "Grid's stable. Backup's nominal. We're seeing your power draw. It's steady." "It isn't," I said, and heard how I sounded. I stepped back. It was important not to sound like that. "It's steady according to your equipment," I said, and got my comm back like a tool I dropped and found under a rag. "You'll want to schedule a visit. Tomorrow," the voice said, remarkable for not arguing. "We'll have Harrow do a drop." I stood with the handheld still close to my mouth, breathing. "Copy." The voice spoiled it at the end, maybe because it needed to be human to itself. "You doing okay out there?" "Just me," I said. Automatic is tied. I killed the transmission because he had given me what I needed, and I had nothing I could say that would be dignified. I sat on the iron steps with my back to the inner curve, toolbox beside me, and timed my breathing to the rotation. 31 seconds for a full sweep. 3 seconds of nothing. Then 4. Then 6. I counted like a child learning fear has meters and rhyme. The space inside the lighthouse changed that night. It was not a room I knew. It had the same walls, the same stupid scratch where I'd moved a ladder and chipped paint and told myself I'd fix it later. But the air put its hand on the back of my neck and held it there. "Look," it said, and didn't show me anything. At 0310, the foghorn did its thing. Long, low, comforting to those who grew up with heavy weather and open water. The extra horn answered. The call and response made a sentence that wasn't in my language. My skin understood it anyway. It was the feeling of two men at a bar turning their stools to face each other when you had thought they were talking to you. Harrow came at noon the next day, which meant the sea had decided to be reasonable for a few hours. The air had a burnt look the way air gets when the sun roars behind fog and chews it translucent. He came with a deckhand who had a face like a hatchet and a crate with a percussion to it that said metal inside. "Got you a new relay board," Harrow said, jamming the bow into the cradle and letting the swell do the lifting. "And a new lamp, because the boys like to be thorough when they're afraid." "They say afraid?" "Not with their mouths," he said, and shrugged. He scanned the lantern room, which was a habit he couldn't stop. "You got birds?" "Not last night." "Good," he said, as if not being hit by small bodies was something I had arranged. "We'll be quick." We were not. Everything that should have been easy came with rusted stubbornness, as if the place had decided to hold onto its old parts out of principle. Harrow swore. The deckhand kept looking up as if something were hanging from the girders, and he was trying to see how it was anchored. I told myself I was being unfair to him because some faces just looked like that. But every time the light passed the trouble arc, every time it dimmed, even in day, when the beam was more idea than ray, the deckhand flinched. We got the new board in, and it ran clean, because of course it did while we had company. The lamp looked virginal. The motor hummed like a cat. Harrow signed a sheet with a green pen he always used, as if green meant yes. "We'll see it from the channel tonight," he said. We'll call you if it coughs." "Please do," I said, and tasted iron again, even though my coffee was gone. When they cast off, I stood on the catwalk with a fist on the rail and the other in my pocket around the LED torch like a talisman. The Gull tried to sit on the service vent, and the wind pushed it off. It swore at the wind in the Gull way, which is to say it made a noise that makes everything else on Earth feel insufficiently loud. I told myself I felt better. Then evening folded up the distance, and the beam did its work, and the cough returned. 7 seconds. 3 rotations out of 5. Clean dark in that wedge like a mouth open in a choir. The new board blinked like Christmas was here. The lamp's spine burned. The motor loved me. The result was the same. I did not call Harrow because I knew he was looking, and I knew he'd call if he fancied his eyes. He did not call. The absence of the call felt like a decision made elsewhere. At midnight, the extra horn spoke twice, closer than before. I looked at the chart and tried to imagine a boat there, then a different boat there, and then a screw up on the chart. My brain balked. I carried the service lamp out onto the catwalk and planted my boots and lit the night, and the light came back at me off the fog with its hailstorm protest, and the wedge stayed dark. In that dark, the ocean made one sound only, a long draw, as if something were tasting the air. I lowered the lamp. I let my eyes adjust to the absence. I have never felt anything like the sensation that threaded up from my soles to my tongue then. It was not cold. It was the idea of cold. It was not a hand. It was the memory of a hand that had not yet touched me. It waited to see if I would make a mistake. It trained its patience on me like heat. I went inside and shut the door and put the bar across it, which I rarely use because iron doors are their own declarations. I climbed. The steps were honest underfoot and groaned only where they always groaned. I took a rag and polished the lens, because sometimes doing something pointless but clean resets your head. The glass was cold and perfect and older than my bad mood. It cut and gathered light the way a church gathers voices. At 0:30, the beam failed for 11 seconds. On the 9th second, I smelled something like kelp left too long in sun, sweet and rotten and defensive. On the 10th second, the foghorn didn't sound. It did not sound because sound had no place to go. I said, and I knew I was saying it to the wrong thing, "I see you." It didn't matter. The wrong thing is sometimes the only audience you get. That's when the radio chimed a little stupid chime the mainland never uses. It was the cheap tone my portable made when the battery was at half. The radio wasn't at half. The tone came in over the channel. I picked it up and heard nothing on the first try. On the second try, a voice sat down in my ear, as if it had been perched on my shoulder, waiting for me to notice its weight. "You're not alone," it said. I put the radio down on the floor because my hands told me to. I laced my fingers behind my neck because my sternum told me to. I kneeled because my knees told me to. None of this was voluntary, which is another way to say it relied on very old rules I'd agreed to without signing. "You're not alone," it said again. The voice was mine if I'd been drowning and try not to tell anyone about it. I stood. I forced my thighs to join the conversation. I flicked the mic with a nail. "Identify your station." The silence made a shape. "Identify yours," the voice said, in a tone that would have been mocking if it didn't feel like biting into a lemon. I could have said my call sign. I could have said Blackcap. Instead, I said what I had been told 10 years ago and had told myself 100 times since. Never let the tower go dark after sundown. The beam passed the wedge. For 3 seconds the night had a heart. Then it didn't. I did not sleep after that. Morning came like a truth too simple to believe. The Gull left a dropping on the vent with a precision I respected. The ocean put back its layers one by one, stacked its sounds neatly, fluffed its kelp smell until it was merely sea and not a message. I could have convinced myself that I'd had a bad night. Men had bad nights, even when their buildings were inland and didn't speak. At 10, Harrow's bow nuzzled the cradle again. He climbed like a man who had to tell a friend that a third friend had not made it. He had a paper in his hand whose weight wasn't enough to justify the way his knuckles whitened around it. "Techs want to shut down," he said. "They think if we take the tower dark a cycle, we can test loads. Diagnostics. Narrow something." I stared at his mouth. Sometimes the right words need a minute to fight through the wrong sounds. "At night. After sundown," he said. He tried to smile and gave up. "I know your rule. I know. I recognize the paper now. A formal notice. Sign here to acknowledge." He looked tired in the way of a good man asked to do clown work at a funeral. "I won't," I said, and the way I said it surprised me. Not loud. Like granite. "Then the boys will do it," he said. "I'm sorry. They can do it on paper," I said. "Here? No. We didn't fight. There was no room for it in the stairwell." He left the paper on the kitchen table. He left a box of fresh fruit. He left a bottle of something that pretended to be medicine and was better than that. On the way down, he stopped on the landing below the service room and put his palm on the wall the way people touch the granite at memorials. He didn't look back as he descended, because that was the kind of looking that cost you later. I watched him go. The boat dented its way back toward the gray line of a coast. At sundown, the beam took its place, loyal as a dog at a grave. The wedge took its place, too. I stood in the lantern room and arranged my face into something small. The radio spoke in my voice, and I let it. I didn't answer. I unrolled a length of tape and made myself useful, marking the panel with clean labels, as if clarity could be transmitted through plastic. At 0217, I went out on the catwalk and put my hand out toward the wedge. I didn't touch it. I don't know why. I had meant to. My hand stopped a foot from air that wasn't air. I felt the idea of cold. I closed my fingers, and the feeling pressed against my knuckles like a cat, insisting on being noticed. Something tapped the glass in the lantern room then. A soft tap, hungry and polite. I turned and saw a shadow behind the prism. Then another, as if birds had decided to mistake the light for sunrise. Only we didn't get many birds in fog this dense, and what marks they leave were not smeared like these, not hand height, not urgent without being loud. The tapping went around with the rotation. It kept the beam's pace like a dance partner. I stepped back inside. I locked the door. I put the bar across it again because it made me feel like a man who could do something about anything. The tapping stayed gentle, something taking the measure of a door. I'm not proud of what I did next. I fetched the old keeper's stool from the service room and set it under the emergency hatch to the dome. I climbed onto the stool and pushed the hatch and looked out onto the lantern's roof, which was slick and honest and gave me nothing to land on. I put my head out anyway because a small, stupid part of me wanted proof I could carry in my mouth. The fog glowed in the beam like milk around a spoon. The wedge was a tongue pressed to glass. The horn moaned and the extra answered, "Closer," or else I had moved some interior dial that made everything sound nearer. My radio crackled against my hip. It made the half-battery chime. It did it twice and then went quiet, and the silence felt like relief from a headache I hadn't known I had. When I lowered myself back onto the stool was wet. Not condensation. I smelled the sweet rot. I wiped my palm on my pant leg, and the smell came with it. Not weaker, not stronger. Smell that had weight. I set the stool down, and it made a noise against the iron that sounded like embarrassment. I didn't tell the mainland about the smell. I didn't tell Harrow about the taps. I told the log everything except where my thoughts had gone. I'm telling you now where they went only because if I don't, none of the rest makes the sense I'm pretending it makes. My thoughts went to a long time ago, the first week I had the light to myself, when I woke to the motor still and the lamp dead and the clock above the sink with its face slack and blank. I had slept past my alarm. I had not wound the clock. I had run up the steps swearing and crying, and the old keeper had been there, thin as wire, shoving past me, and he had thrown the switch with a fluidity I still don't possess. The beam had surged, and we had stood there breathing like men who had carried a piano up a hill. He had put his mouth near my ear, and in a voice that belongs only to the people you have earned, he had said, "Don't let it take the first mistake from you. It eats. If you feed it, it remembers." He did not say what it was because he was not a fool. We name things to give ourselves the illusion they'll come when called. I stayed up until dawn and then beyond it because being awake was cheaper than what sleep would charge. At 0900, I took a kitchen knife and cut the blue yarn into 3 pieces and tied them around the 3 handles I touched most at night. Lantern door, service room, kitchen. They looked childish and good. They looked like promises. At 1100, the radio voice that was mine hummed a wrong little song and said, "Open." I did not. My fingers lay quiet on the table. My throat did too, but somewhere behind my face, something leaned toward the kitchen door. My shoulders stayed chair-shaped. I made tea. The kettle knew its part and sang. When the sun went down, I stood with my hand on the panel. I told it a story I had never told anything. I told it that if the beam failed for more than 12 seconds, I would break the glass and wire the service lamp into the rail and feed it battery and burn holes in the fog with modest, stubborn light all night. It failed for 11 seconds. Twice. Something knew my number. Something understood that math isn't just counting. It's communication. Much later, when the night had worn itself down to threads and my eyelids had become heavy enough to anchor a boat, the thing that wasn't a voice said in a place that wasn't the radio, "Okay." It did not mean it the way a friend does. It meant we are in agreement. You stay. I stay. We honor this. I stood in the dawn and watched the fog roll off the black. The gull tipped its head. The smell went away. The horn spoke with its old grammar. The wedge was a memory only the lens kept. I cleaned the glass with alcohol and a rag. I washed my hands twice, and the smell came back at the second knuckle for a breath, and then thought better of it. I signed for another new relay board the next day and smiled at Harrow as if I had slept. I told the tech, when he called, that we were stable and that diagnostics could be delayed, which made him happy because paper loves postponements. I ate a pear too fast and cut my mouth on its sweetness. I lay on my bunk in the hour after lunch when boats look like toys and the sea looks like a metal sheet, and I stared at the peeling paint and I waited for my pulse to argue with me. At sundown, the beam took its place. It did not cough. The wedge did not chew. I told myself this is how it ends. This is the part where the thing you feared proves to be shadows in a country of logic. I told myself that fear has a half-life, and I had outlasted it. I told myself that. I didn't believe me. The horn moaned its long low. The extra did not answer. The radio stayed quiet. The lantern's glass kept its cold. The room behind me kept its warmth. I thought about the rule the old keeper had given me, and about how rules are not prohibitions but warnings disguised as orders. Then, without thinking I was doing a dramatic thing, without thinking at all, I said it out loud to the air that had learned my voice and timing and breath. I said it the way a man recites a prayer to see if his voice will tremble. Never let the tower go dark after sundown. The light did not fail that night. It failed the next one. The day had been clean, blue that made the metal look honest. A breeze steady enough to make flags of the gulls. I ate real food and tasted all of it. I made a joke into the void about invoices and hazard pay, and the void didn't laugh, which was fine. After sundown, the beam took its smooth turn like a wrist tracing a circle on a table. I stood in the lantern room and watched the prisms bite and release the world. I listened for the horn's grammar. I counted without meaning to. The wedge swallowed the light on the 4th rotation. 5 seconds. 8. 10. I felt that same draw from below, that long, tasting inhale. I thumbed the service lamp and hugged its heat with my palm until the metal gritted my skin. I didn't go outside. I stared straight into the place where the light should have been and told every part of me that wanted to lean forward that it could lean backward instead. When the light returned, it returned hard, as if embarrassed. The glass steadied. The motor purred like it had a conscience. I wrote down the seconds because numbers were a leash. At 0140, I heard the crate in the supply shed buckle and slam once, then twice, then breathe. Wind could do that. What could do that? So could things that liked how a man's attention moved when you fed it noises. I brought the LED torch and my stubber to the door and unbarred it, and stepped in a fog that was thinner than 2 nights ago, but thicker than I wanted. My breath rose and broke. The catwalk grated under my boots with its old complaint. I scanned the rock edge and the crane hoist and the seam where the ladder used to be. The line I'd seen earlier wasn't there. I knew it wasn't there before my eyes agreed. Knowing has a temperature. The shed door creaked open an inch. The lock was that chalk bloom again, frosted with the ocean's memory. I could have sworn I had shot the bolt. I could have sworn lots of things the last week. I pulled the door and it came easy, too easy. Inside, the spare lamp sat like a monk still. The relay boxes waited like sleeping dogs. The crate with the metal percussion had shifted forward across grooves I hadn't noticed before and now could not unsee. Not tracks, not dragged, moved in tiny hops, as if lifted and set down and lifted again. My shoulders tried to come up around my ears, and I told them to behave. I closed the door and drove the bolt and taped a strip across it. The tape was boring office tape. It looked like cowardice and good sense. When I turned to walk back, the horn called, and the answer came close, too close to be anything that belonged to old maps. The answer sounded hoarse, like air forced through a throat that was learning how throats worked. I moved fast without running. Inside, bar across. Steps honest. Lantern room bright. I pressed my palm to the warm housing and counted to 20 and didn't know if I was praying or hammering a nail into nothing. I didn't sleep. Morning came and scrubbed the edges off the bed. I brewed coffee so strong a spoon would have stood. I went looking for ordinary tasks and let them work on me. The weather mast wanted attention. The gusset plates cried for grease. The kitchen clock needed winding. The blue yarn on the kitchen handle was on the floor. The knot was intact. The loop was not. It had been slipped off, not cut. It lay curled like a little dead thing. I picked it up and my fingers came away damp. I washed my hands until the skin pulled tight and the damp feeling sat there anyway, a memory that had time to make itself comfortable. Harrow called at noon to say the techs had argued themselves back to patience. They like data, he said. You keep feeding them those seconds and arcs. They'll build a case. Case for what? He didn't answer. The radio hissed like a cat and went polite again. I'll swing by tomorrow with a second portable. Just in case. The day stayed polite. It stayed so polite, I wanted to kick it in the shins. I walked the perimeter and found a rocking stone and wiggled it, and the cedar wedge I'd shoved there a decade back spit itself out like a seed. I put it back and used my boot heel as a hammer. The basalt held it with a sound like a throat swallowing. Back inside, I wrote a few lines in a notebook that wasn't a log. Not numbers. Notes about how a place felt. It made me angry to do it. It felt like bringing a candle to an interrogation and calling it evidence. The wind shifted at sundown. I could smell mud I couldn't see. Tidal mud from flats that didn't exist on Blackcap's hard edge. The beam went up. The horn spoke. The ocean answered with its layers stacked neatly. I dared to think I might get to breathe like a normal animal for a night. On the 7th rotation, the light thinned. Not gone. Not absence. Thin like a man who has been sick all winter. I could trace the backbone of the beam through the wedge if I inhaled and held. The taps on the glass began again. 1, 2, 3, then the gap of the lamp cage, then again, paced exactly to the rotation. Not birds, not random. Fingertips without fingers. Sampled, measured. I put my hand against the inner glass. The cold came in like a thought that hadn't learned words yet. My hand tingled. I could feel where the taps would land, a fraction before they did. The way you can feel the lull between waves when you're thigh deep and about to jump. Enough, I said, but I didn't raise my voice. I didn't look away. The taps kept their appointment. I kept mine. They stopped at 0200. The horn blared. The answer came right under us, as if something the size of a barge had shouldered up to the rock and breathed. I went down 2 flights to the service room and opened the tool cabinet and looked at things that make men brave. Wrenches, cutters, blades dull and new, a little mallet with a mushroomed head, a coil of high-gauge wire that could make a temporary life out of faith and battery. I counted the emergency flares. I put 2 in my pocket because I wanted my pockets to feel heavier. When I came back up, the radio on my hip chimed the half-battery tone again, and I watched the charge on the screen sit there at full, pleased with itself. The wrong tone sounded again. Then a human breath, but not mine, not in rhythm. A breath learning. Open, it said after the breath had practiced. The word came wet. Not slobber, not dripping. Saturated, like cloth soaked in brine. No, I said. The mallet would have been ridiculous against air. The mallet made me feel like a man in a story who insisted on holding a nail while the house burned, so no one could say he'd forgotten what houses were for. Open, it said again. Not pleading. Instruction with patience wrapped in it. The beam slipped to a thread. I felt the idea of cold punch through my shirt and spread under my ribs like breath held too long. The horn didn't answer our own call. For a long 12 count, the world and I had an understanding. I did not move. It did not either. The light returned. The world stacked its sounds again like plates on a shelf. At 0313, I heard a scrape under the catwalk. Not a fish body. Not a gull's claws. Iron on basalt. The scrape ran along the curve of the tower like a compass, drawing a circle, and then stopped under the lantern. I held my breath, and it moved again, faster, as if learning. When it reached the old cut ladder seam, it paused. I waited for a rattle, a test. None came. It slid away, and the horn spoke, and the answer did not. I didn't sleep. Dawn pulled the fog apart like chewing gum. The smell of rot stayed low, hugging the seams between rock and iron. I stepped out to the catwalk and looked down. Wet streaks shined on the basalt where no water should have reached. Not spray lines. Narrow. Vertical. 5 of them, together. You don't need me to tell you what that pattern looks like. You've seen hands. I went to the service room sink and washed nothing off my hands. The water ran and ran. It had a taste like pennies again. When I shut it off, the pipes groaned. A real, familiar groan with a beginning and end, and that felt good. Ordinary pain is a gift. Harrow didn't make it at noon. The wind came up fast, the way it does when the pressure forgets its script. He radioed to say he was turning back because the wheel liked him alive. His voice was small with distance and weather and something he didn't want to name. Tomorrow, he said. I'll try again. Roger, I said. All my yes had become Rogers. Weather wants to be forgiven. By evening, the wind had fallen to a muscle ache. The fog returned like a patient at a clinic, on time and with its papers in order. I ate crackers because crackers survive everything. At 2,100, the light winked. At 2102, it did it again and did not return. I looked at the seconds crawl over my watch face and hated them personally. 10, 15, 20. I didn't panic. You might think I did. Panic is messy. This was clean. I grabbed the wire coil and the service lamp and the cutters and the flare, and my hands moved with the smarts you get from doing one job longer than you should. I killed the breaker to the lantern motor because I needed the lens still. I popped the lantern door and stepped into a cold that had been waiting just outside the glass, head lowered, ready to charge. My breath went white and tried to stay there. It didn't because the wedge had no use for gifts. The world outside the glass wasn't black. Black is honest. This was light drained, a gray that felt thick like the inside of a whale's mouth. I mounted the service lamp to the inner rail, wiring it ugly but tight. I finished the second connection, and the lamp bit hard into the wedge like a dog in a cloth. The beam it made wasn't pretty. It was enough. The horn spoke. The answer came from farther away this time, or I had said something right with my hands. I flipped the breaker for the lens motor. It started to turn and then stuttered like it had been shoved. The prisms groaned, and the groan had teeth in it. Teeth I had put there by thinking about teeth. I turned it back off. I didn't need spin. I needed any light at all. The service lamp held. I stood there on the threshold with my head halfway into that wrong gray and my calf muscles telling me to pull back, and I said the kind of thing men say in bars to themselves. Good. The taps on the glass started again, faster. Not in time with rotation anymore. In time with my breath, I stepped fully inside the lantern room and shut the door. The bar made its honest noise, the one like a bolt thrown in a book's spine. The taps grew softer when I backed away from the glass, as if the thing behind them wanted to keep the conversation private. The radio hummed. The wrong chime. The wet breath. Open. No. Open. A pause. Then, in a voice that put gravel in my ears, please. The word came bent, like a rusted nail, pulled and straightened and pulled again. I sat down on the iron step with the wire crimper still in my hand and told my heart it could go as fast as it needed. It went. It settled. It went again. That's what hearts do when they don't want to be a part of the current conversation. They excuse themselves and come back with coffee they didn't want. The service lamp burned all night. The wrong gray leaned and failed. The horn called and the answer drifted. I felt the idea of cold lean against the glass and smile without a mouth. I did not sleep. Dawn came as if disappointed I had stayed. I checked the jury rig twice and added a third point of contact. It looked like a diagram drawn by a drunk, but it would do. I wrote it up for the log and used words I hoped would keep me employed and not institutionalized. At noon, the weather gave Harrow back to me. He came out with the deckhand and the green pen and a third man who didn't like boats. You can tell. He moved like land would be there if he demanded it with his posture. He had soft hands and a hard mouth and the kind of jacket men wear when they want to be mistaken for the sort of men who don't feel cold. He said his name. I forgot it when it hit the fog. He said he was from the agency and had authority to order a full shutdown for diagnostics. He smiled the way men smile at funerals when they want you to like them enough to accept the worst thing they'll say today. We can do that during the day, I said, polite all the way to the bone. After sundown makes more sense, he said. We need load conditions to replicate the fault. You'll get them, I said, without dark. Harrow watched us like a man between two strangers with knives at a wedding. The deckhand looked at the glass like it owed him money. We'll be staying, the agency man said. He lifted a case that clinked. We have portable meters. Scopes. We'll sit right up there with you. If you like, I said, and try not to show them what that sentence cost me. They came inside and made themselves at home in the way of men who don't believe in home. The agency man set a little censer on the kitchen table and frowned at numbers. The deckhand stood, then sat, then stood again. Harrow drank coffee with both hands. His eyes did circuits between my face and the stairs and the door. Quiet here, the agency man said. Most of the time. He smiled. Heard your unofficial report. Interesting phenomena. Where from? He tapped the case. Channels have ears. I didn't broadcast phenomena, I said. I broadcast faults. He nodded, pleased with the word. Faults. They climbed when the sun did its lowering and the fog made its promises. The agency man liked the lantern room. He set his devices on the iron grating and frowned at their uprisings and rebellions. The deckhand stood with his back to a strut like a boy with his back to a tree he hopes will stop a bear. Harrow leaned on the wall and stared at the beam as if it were a friend who'd started telling a story he already knew. The light went smooth for half an hour. The agency man looked bored and then offended and then eager again when the first thinness arrived. He leaned over a screen and said, there, like a fisherman who wants everyone to notice his hook. Voltage drop? Harrow asked without taking his eyes off the glass. No. Amplitude stable. It's not electrical. It's look at this. He rotated a little display, and lines jittered like ants. Intensity dip without draw variance. That's not a thing. It is here, I said, and surprised myself by sounding kind. The wedge went hungry then. The beam laid itself down and didn't get back up. The agency man gasped and then tried to make the sound mean curiosity. Don't, I said, because his hand had started for the door. He held it in air and turned it into an itch on his chin. We need a measure outside. We don't. He didn't like being told that in front of other men. His mouth got thinner. His posture took on righteousness like a coat. Open, the radio said on my hip, calm as church. The deckhand said a bad word under his breath, and faced the wall and said it again to the wall. Ignore that, the agency man said, too quickly, as if he were scolding a dog. You ignore it, Harrow said, soft, and the way he said it made the room notice him again. The taps began. They went around with the dead rotation. The agency man swallowed and tried to make it look like adjusting his throat. He touched his meter, and the meter spat symbols he didn't admire. What is that? He asked the meter, as if it owed him an answer. What is that? The horn didn't speak. The answer did, from right below, a sound like a pallet dragged across wet stone. Stay away from the door, I said. No one's at the door, he said, and then, angry at how that sounded, we need data. Then put your ear on the floor, Harrow said. He didn't. He put his mouth near the glass instead, like a man challenging whether to act right. The beam coughed, then flared, hard, bright, combative, as if offended, and the agency man flinched so beautifully I almost liked him. The service lamp wired to the rail burned steady, cheap and defiant. The wrong gray leaned and failed to drown it. The taps softened when the light pressed harder when it thinned. The deckhand started muttering word from a childhood he'd pretended he didn't remember. I knew some of them. The old keeper had known them all. The radio gave its wet breath and found a new toy. Harrow, it said, in Harrow's voice, but slowed, as if someone had pulled him through syrup. Harrow closed his eyes, and his mouth folded into itself. No, he said to his own name. No, you don't. Open, it said, sweeter. Please. No one moved. The beam held, thin and unhandsome, but there. I could smell the rot like a note under a chord. It had a rhythm now. Time to the taps, time to the horn's absence, time to the quiver under the floor when the scrape circled the bass. It went on like that too long, and then stopped all at once. Not the light. Everything else. The room fell into a silence, so complete it had geometry. I could have measured it with calipers. The agency man's devices went clean, lines flat, as if there had never been a number in them at all. Then the glass breathed. You'll tell me glass can't. I would have told you too. But the panes shifted in the frames with a soft, sticky sound like wet hands separating in and out once, twice. My ears popped. The service lamp flickered and recovered. The main beam shredded at the edges like paper rubbed too thin. Back, I said to everyone, and to myself, and to the part of me that wanted to lean forward. I put the crimpers down and picked up one of the flares and hated the way it made my hand happy. The agency man leaned in. Something touched the glass on the outside opposite his face. Not hard, just enough to make the pane go concave and bow toward him. The tooth scrape sound came again, iron at rock, under us, around us. He whispered, because people whisper to things they don't respect when they finally meet them. What are you? The pane exhaled. His breath steamed it. On the other side of that little fog circle, something steamed it back. Back, I said again louder. He didn't hear me, because his name came from the radio, in my voice, spoken with a care I say for things I never wanted to say. He turned his head toward his own name, and that was when the pain bulged out. Not in, out like an enormous lung had filled and pushed. The brass frame groaned and snapped a sound like an arrow shaft breaking, and for half a second there was a gap the width of 2 fingers and the length of my fear. The rot smell came through it like breath through a straw. The agency man reeled backward, and I caught his jacket, and he felt like a man, and I dragged him to the center of the floor, and my hands kept a list of his bones. The pain settled back. The gap closed. The crack that ran from the corner like a spider's leg stayed. The taps resumed, polite, almost amused. The agency man sat with his legs wrong in front of him, and he made a noise I had made in my first year here when a wave taught me about weight. He started to laugh, and his laugh had the sharp edges of someone finding out a story about himself wasn't true. We're leaving, he said, and looked at Harrow like a brother. We are leaving now. We are, Harrow said, already moving in his head through the weather and the swell and the ladder with a man whose legs didn't want to help. The deckhand had both palms flat to the floor. He whispered the childhood words. He looked at me like I could tell him how much of his prayer to say. "We'll go at dawn," I said. "You won't make the cradle in this." I nodded toward the fog, as if it were a person. "You know that." Harrow did. His face made a map of it, and then folded it away. "Dawn," he said. "Dawn," the radio said, tasting the word like a new food. We waited. The beam did its stubborn work. The horn didn't. The answer didn't either. The rot smell deepened, then thinned. At 0340, the deckhand fell asleep, upright against the strut, his mouth open in a protest letter addressed to whoever reads such things. The agency man stared at the crack in the pane, like it contained instructions for being human. Harrow sat with his arms on his knees and his hands clasped, and every now and then his fingers twitched as if counting nets. I stood. I didn't know why until I felt the floor shift to meet my weight. The scrape began again under us, then stopped, then started, irregular now, like someone learning to climb stairs. "No," I said to the floor. The floor didn't answer. It never does. It held. The light made its thread and didn't break. The horn found its voice again at 0505. When dawn came, it came like a favor you don't think you deserve. We moved. The deckhand woke with a gasp and stood with his knees locked so they wouldn't betray him. The agency man moved like a man who had borrowed his own body for the first time. Harrow went first down the stairs, then the agency man, then the deckhand. I brought up the rear with the flare in my pocket and the wire cutters in my hand, because the things you carry tell the day what it can do to you. We reached the kitchen, and the blue yarn on the handle was where I had tied it last, bright and silly and good. The agency man paused and touched it like a charm. Outside, the fog lay low, sliding off the rock in long sheets like muscle. Harrow judged the swell with his eyes and his jaw, and he didn't like what he saw, but he liked it better than staying. We got to the door. The bar made its honest noise. The agency man stopped with his hand on the handle and looked at me, really looked, as if he had found a man-shaped thing he understood as a noun at last. "Tell them," he said. "Tell them whatever you have to. Whatever keeps them from this." "I will," I said. I did not have the right verbs. We stepped out into a morning that pretended to be friendlier than it was. The catwalk was slick only where it always was. The scrape marks on the basalt had dried into nothing. The cradle took Harrow's boat with a grunt, and then a surge like a tired animal. The deckhand moved like a man who had already told the worst story of his life and was waiting to see if it would make him live or die. The agency man wouldn't look up at the lantern room. I watched them cast off and the bow dip and the stern rise and the little boat go tense in its ropes like a mouth trying to say a difficult word. A wave lifted them and then set them down, and then the last rope came free and they were out past the boil where Blackcap pissed on itself, and then beyond that. I stood until the shape of them became a moving line in the gray. The gull landed and pecked the vent, and I gave a cracker, and it took it with ceremony. My hand shook when I reached for the kettle, and that wasn't fear. That was relief being a bad electrician inside the body. I made tea. I sat. I wrote. I went up and checked the service lamp wiring and cinched one contact, because contact wants checking. I put my palm on the warm housing, and it was warm. Midday came and went, another tide. Harrow did not arrive at noon. The radio stayed polite and empty. The coast relay did its little test pings, and I answered in the code a man uses when he can't afford to confess. Afternoon pulled color out of the sky like thread from a shirt until only the bare cloth was left. At 17:30, the fog rolled in with purpose, as if it had gotten off a bus at the right stop. The crack in the pane made a little silver line. I cleaned the glass for it and told it I saw it, and that was the end of the conversation. I turned the main lamp on. It burned like a backbone. The motor took its rotation like a vow. The service lamp sat on the rail with its ugly, perfect light, ready. The horn spoke. The answer came from far off, and then nearer, and then from below. It was lower than before, as if whatever used the horn now had a bigger chest. I stood with both hands on the panel and my face empty. The beam reached its worst arc and stayed. Seconds piled up. 10. 15. 25. The service lamp flickered once and then burned steady. The pane breathed, and the crack lengthened the width of my thumbnail. "Open," said the voice that had used mine and Harrow's, and now had the grace to use itself. It sounded like rocks and cloth and water shaken from hair. It sounded like a long practice session, finding confidence. "No," I said. It didn't argue. It didn't need to. The taps began and kept perfect time with my pulse now. The scrape under us circled once and stopped directly beneath the lantern room. The smell rose like a hand. I took the flare from my pocket and pulled the cap and thumbed the striker. The red bit the air and threw a tantrum of light that made the fog blush. I held it out over the catwalk through the open lantern door, arm locked, and the flare spit and the scream had a pitch inside it that made the panes hum. The wedge did not like the flare. It fell back a little. The breath at the crack cooled. The rot smell went from the center of my head back down to the floor and sulked. I stood there until the flare burned down to a nub that bit my glove, and the ash fell, and the spark spun out into the gray and died messy little deaths. The wedge leaned again when the flare died. It took the same space back a child takes after a scold. I realized, standing there with my fist full of stink and light, that the thing had learned my edges. It knew how far I would go. It knew I didn't step outside. It knew my voice and the shapes I made in the air without sound. It had collected my seconds. It had kept them like coins. The radio crackled. The wrong chime. Then a voice I didn't know. A woman. Young. Scared. Radio scared, which is braver than most people manage. "Blackcap, this is the trawler Magdalene, 6 miles south-southeast. We're seeing your light go weird. You got a situation." I breathed like a man who hadn't in an hour. "Magdalene, Blackcap. Confirmed situation. Diagnostics in progress. Maintain distance. Visibility variable." There was a pause. "Looks like you got company," she said, and tried to laugh and failed. "We're seeing a gap. Never seen that. Should we call it in?" "Already called," I said. "Maintain distance." Another pause. Then a whisper she didn't mean to send. "Don't like that smell." The transmission cut. I put my face against the cold glass and watched the beam try to teach the wedge manners. The wedge took notes with its fingers. At 2015, the horn died completely. No call. No answer. The silence made a hole in the night you could have fallen through if you weren't careful where you put your feet inside your head. My hands practiced with the second flare. I didn't light it. I wanted it unburned the way men want bullets to stay in their pockets. "Open," the voice said, soft now, coaxing, and the door bar lifted a fraction of an inch by itself and fell again as if reconsidering. I put my palm on it and felt nothing but iron. The deck plates under the lantern shuddered as something shouldered them from the outside. The bolts sang the bad, little high song old metal sings when asked questions it doesn't want to answer anymore. The crack grew longer. A drop formed at its end. Not water. Something heavier. It hung there like a child about to test gravity with a penny off a bridge. I could have thrown the second flare then. I didn't. I did something worse and better. I turned the lantern motor back on. The prisms moved. The beam cut the wedge with motion and not just presence. The taps scrambled to keep time and failed, staggered, fell out of step. The pane's breathing lost sync. The drop trembled and slid sideways along the crack instead of down. The voice tried again. It had lost some patience and found some volume. "Open." "No," I said, and felt a calm I hadn't earned. "You had all night to ask." It went quiet in the way predators go quiet when they realize their first approach didn't work and the meal is going to require different manners. The scrape under us, which I had been feeling for so long I had forgotten its teeth, stopped. The smell receded. The wedge loosened an inch too. The horn spoke. The answer came from far away, a long, sad thing, and I tried to decide if sadness made it less dangerous or more. The light held. I stood in the lantern room until my knees wobbled and my eyes felt like they had been sanded. The beam behaved like a good dog that knows this is the night you need proving. The crack in the pane dried. The drop crusted over like salt. The radio said nothing useful. When dawn came, it came badly in tatters. The fog didn't want to go. The wedge didn't either. It thinned. It didn't break. I made tea, and my hand shook, and I spilled, and the spill looked like a map of a place I didn't want to visit. I took the mug to the catwalk, and the gull scolded me because I was late with its cracker. I gave it too. Around 9, the agency man called on a mainland line I didn't recognize. His voice had edges it hadn't yesterday. "We made port," he said. "We're filing a report." "Put everything in it," I said. "Everything you can." He hesitated. "They'll think." "Let them," I said. "Tell it anyway." He coughed a laugh that hated itself. "You keep doing whatever you did." "I don't know what I did." "Do it again." The call ended. I wrote numbers. I cleaned. I checked bolts. I wrote more numbers. I took a nap like a man who had crashed a car without moving from his chair. At 1700, the sky went ugly green under the gray. At 1800, the first thunder came, not from the clouds, from the water. A low thump from below, like something very large had let itself back to earth. I stood with my hand on the panel and felt the tower translate it through the iron into my bones. Night came early, and the beam went out on the second rotation. I didn't wait for seconds to count me. I killed the motor. I hit the service lamp, and it spit reluctant light, and then took heart and burned. I lit the second flare, and the red ripped a hole in the fog that closed slower than the night before. The tap pattern was gone now. This was not tapping. This was a hand slid all the way across a pane. Then another. Then another. 5 panes worth, then back. A caress that wanted to measure the hole. I don't know when I started talking. Maybe after the 4th pane. Maybe when the rot smell found the back of my teeth. I said every true thing I knew about the tower. I said where the weight shift lived on the second landing, and where the rail always gave a little right of the service door, and which bolts had fights with salt all winter, and how the lamp felt under my palm when it was happy and when it was not. I said everything aloud the way men say confessions to wooden booths. The words didn't push anything back. They kept me whole. That mattered. A shape leaned in the flare light then. Not a head. Not a body. A rejection of those things. It ate outline. My eye kept trying to draw edges around it and failing. It made me feel like a child with 2 big gloves trying to pick up needles. I kept the flare out. The flare hated me, and I loved it. I fed the service lamp fresh battery. When I had to, I let the motor sleep. The beam from the main lamp stayed dead until 0300 and then came back hard and stayed. The pane stopped breathing. The crack went asleep. When dawn finally dragged itself over the horizon, it did it the way men drag refrigerators. No grace, only will. The wedge thinned and scowled and slid away. The horn moaned, and the answer, from way out where it belonged, if it belonged at all, moaned back and then disappeared under the morning's flat voice. I sat on the floor of the lantern room with my back to the cold, perfect glass and the smell still in my nose, and I laughed the kind of laugh that is only air working wrong in the throat. I slept. I shook myself awake like a wet dog. I made tea. I put the kettle on the step beside me and fell asleep again, sitting up, and dreamed of hands. Harrow came at noon with 2 deckhands and faces that looked like they had never not been tired. He had a coil of new bar for the door and a case for the pane, and a look he didn't wear often, respect with fear braided into it. He didn't glance up at the lantern. He looked at me and nodded once like a man saying yes to a debt. "Boat," he said, and jerked his head and tried not to grin like an idiot. We brought a bigger one. I told him what had happened. Not all the words. Enough. He looked at the crack and the salt crust at the end of it and said nothing because sometimes that's the sentence. "You should," he began, and stopped because there wasn't a should for this. "I know," I said. "The agency's sending papers," he said, lighter again, because paper is the only courage cities know. "They want a formal shutdown tomorrow night. They said you defied an order." I sipped tea that tasted like pennies and said nothing. "You want me to bring you in before dusk?" he asked, and he had to know what I would say. I said the only thing I could say. "I don't need to write it here." "You know what it was?" He nodded. He exhaled like a brother. He set the extra portable on my table. He left. The afternoon stayed honest. The gull bullied me out of a cracker and posed like a saint. The blue yarn on the kitchen handle looked ridiculous and good. I thought about cutting it off. I left it where it was. I thought about sleeping. I didn't. Sundown arrived with fog that had learned my address by heart. The beam took its place. The horn spoke. The answer did not. I stood in the lantern room with both hands on the panel and felt the tower wait. A full rotation. Another. The wedge came late, as if to make a point, and swallowed everything it could reach. I didn't count. I didn't fetch. I just stood until the idea of cold crept into my bones in a way that made my elbows feel older than they were. And then I reached down and flipped the motor, and the beam moved and carved, and the wedge flexed, and the pane breathed, and the crack drank a drop of something, and I stood and breathed with it. I don't know how long I stood there. I don't know what hour it was when a voice stopped asking. I know that at some point the horn spoke again, and the answer didn't. I know the service lamp burned down, and I fed it and burned it down again. I know dawn came, thin but present. I know I survived because I am writing this. That week lasted a year. When the agency paper came the next day, it came with words that had never met the ocean. They wanted the tower dark. They wanted diagnostics. They wanted a man to comply. I boiled water and poured it over grounds that weren't worth the trouble and drank anyway. I folded the paper and set it under the leg of the stool that wobbled. It made the stool steady. That seemed like the most useful thing it could do. Harrow didn't come. The fog made choices for him. The radio relayed other people's weather. The gull stared at the pane crack and pecked the brass once and cocked its head like a mechanic. Sundown came. The light worked. The wedge came late and stayed little longer. The horn learned a new grammar and then forgot it again. I felt the scrape under us once and then not again. The voice didn't speak. The pane didn't breathe. The crack didn't grow. The smell went down into the iron and waited there like a stain. I slept twice that night, a luxury, and woke both times with my hands closed around nothing and my mouth open to say a word I don't have. Dawn came clean. Harrow arrived with fruit and a look that said he had opinions he would let me keep. He handed me an envelope with a rubber stamp that had bitten the paper so hard the fibers showed teeth. Inside was a form to sign and a date and a line where my name should go. I didn't sign. He took it back without argument. He set a thermos on the table and walked the steps and stood in the lantern room with me, without speaking for 5 whole rotations. On the 6th, the beam carried itself past the wedge without a cough. On the 7th, it did the same. He put his palm against the cold glass. He didn't flinch when it stayed glass. "Maybe it's over," he said, and then made a face, because he's lived long enough to know what saying that out loud does. "Maybe," I said. The gull pecked the vent. I gave a cracker. It choked it down like a man with a pill and strutted off like a king. That would be a good place to stop, wouldn't it? It would be nice to end on sun and tea and a man who doesn't make the stupid mistake of counting peace before it has the decency to last a week. 3 nights later, the Magda Leap didn't answer her morning call. The coast relay pinged her. Nothing. Harrow pinged her. Nothing. I stepped onto the catwalk and looked due south-southeast where her captain had said she'd been that night. The fog lay down flat on the water like a dog. At 0930 a piece of trawl, net washed up on the basalt. Nets don't come in that close on blackcap. The currents either eat them or throw them ashore on a beach that can forgive them. This net had a knot tied in it. Not a sailor's knot. A simple loop, clumsy, tight, the kind of knot a child ties when it wants a thing to stay. Inside the loop was a blue length of yarn, bright and cheerful in mine. I took it out with 2 fingers and carried it upstairs and set on the shelf beside the service lamp, and I did not touch it again. I radioed the relay and told them about the net. They thanked me like they were allowed to. They said search and rescue had been notified. I didn't ask for details. I didn't want to know how many men made a boat's name sound like a room that was suddenly empty. That night, when the beam reached the trouble arc, it did not thin. It grew. It burned harder, brighter, angrier. The horn spoke. The answer did not. The pane did not breathe. The crack stayed a little silver line. The smell of rot was there if I went looking for it. I did not. I slept with my back to the tower wall and my boots on and my hand around the handle of the service lamp like a child holding a teddy bear with a head full of wire. I woke to the gull's opinion of my capacity for breakfast service and the sea's usual argument with itself. I made tea. I walked the perimeter. The rock did not try any new tricks. The blue yarn stayed on the shelf, like a sentence a teacher would not let me forget. I didn't touch it. I didn't move it. I let it sit there and make the room look more like mine. There's not a moral. You want one. I want one too. You want me to say I discovered a weakness and defeated a thing that doesn't even believe in the word defeated. You want me to tell you I solved the mystery and saved a boat, and I'm writing this from a porch that faces a lake where the worst thing that happens is ice. I can't. I can tell you the truth the place taught me with its glass and iron and salt and patience. The light stopped working last week. It stopped the way a heart stops and then remembers itself and stutters and overcompensates. Something came for the dark we owed it. It wanted me to help. I did not. I talked to it like a man talks to weather with his hands. It learned me. I learned it back. We're in conversation now, whether I signed up or not. When I climb the stairs at dusk, I put my hand on the rail at the second landing where it flexes. I feel the iron answer, and I know how much give is healthy and how much means mind yourself. I pass the service room, and the door breathes when the wind comes from the west, and I know that isn't a mouth anymore. It's a draft, mostly. I reach the lantern and lay my palm on the housing and feel the lamp's warmth, and I watch the beam move, and I listen for grammar, and I count without counting. If you're waiting for the third thing, you already heard it. I'm not going to say it again. I sleep when I can. I keep crackers for the gull. I keep a flare for myself. I keep a coil of wire that knows more about faith than I do. I keep the blue yarn on the shelf where I can see it. I keep one eye on the pain crack because it keeps one on me. Sometimes, between horn calls, I hear the scrape. Not all the way around. Not eager. Just a reminder. Like a neighbor tapping the wall to let you know the building isn't empty. Sometimes the radio chimes the wrong little chime, and I hear a breath that could be mine if I had drowned and crawled back up to learn how to talk again. Sometimes the fog sits right in that arc and refuses to let go of whatever ropes it's holding. Sometimes the beam pushes anyway. Sometimes it doesn't. You ask for a story like the ones people tell online when they want to feel close to a thing too big for their hands. I'm telling you what happened because not telling it feels like leaving a door unlocked. There's a boat that didn't answer. There's a crack in the glass with a crust of something that looks like salt and isn't. There's a knot in a net that no one taught. I'm still here. I'm not brave. I'm the man who lives where light makes a promise and weather cashes it. If you find yourself out on a night when the horn's grammar sounds wrong and you see a wedge in a beam that should be whole, don't be curious. Don't be clever. Keep your distance. Keep your hands to yourself. Keep your doors shut. And if you ever find yourself on Blackcap, 32 miles off a coast that looks pretty from a distance and like damage up close, and you smell something sweet and dead in a place where the sea usually smells like iron and kelp, and the glass breathes, and a voice that shouldn't have your voice says a word it learned because you didn't swallow it in time. If that happens, don't open anything you mean to keep.